I'd like to start the third session and the first session of the second day on web history in a changing media environment. And the first speaker will have approximately 20 minutes per talk and then 5 to 10 minutes of questions and answers. The first speaker is Nicholas John from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he'll talk about the internet has always been about sharing.
Good morning. It's all good. Hello. Well, the title of my talk is actually "The Internet Has Always Been About Sharing," or has it? Well, you can guess the answer. But we'll. Good morning. Now I can't see the notes at all. Do you mind if I move this a bit?
You have to be close to the microphone.
Okay, I will be, but I also want to. Okay, well if we can. Okay. And we'll start. Well, I'd like to start by congratulating Dr. Nat Ben David on putting together this remarkable event. That's for you. Which she's still busy organizing, even. And also to thank her for inviting me to be part of it. And I'll do my best to make some kind of contribution to the fascinating discussions that were sparked by yesterday's talks. What I'm going to do is spend about 3/4 of my time talking about research that I've done, that I feel confident in reporting about. Some of it I have reported about in other places, and about 1/4 of my time talking about something very, very new that I'm just starting to work on. Now, I think there can be a number of mutually non-exclusive reasons for being interested in the past, all of which are reflected in the work being presented by the various speakers here. For instance, we might be dedicated to cultural preservation, in which case the archive becomes a project of urgency. It's important that we get it right. Or we might have an unbridled passion for artifacts from the past. Or we might quite simply think that if we want to understand the present, then we need to understand the past. This is a slide I use in my. This is a slide I use when teaching about web histories and archives, in which a clean-shaven. Hang on a second. This isn't showing the slideshow, is it? It's showing it to you, and I'm seeing something different. Okay, that's fine. We're all right. So I showed this slide of a clean-shaven Professor Niels Brugger telling us that if we want to understand the web today, then we need to understand the web of the past, and I find this to be irrefutably true. But I'll add to this the observation, which I hope will not be taken as me lecturing Professor Brugger or any of you, for that matter, on history. But sometimes, my observation is that sometimes the way that we talk about, that our understanding of the web today, or indeed of the world, is based on how we talk about the web, or the world. Okay, we overcome our technical things, hopefully. And this is, there is some kind of disconnect between what I'm seeing and what... Hold on. Not really. I could do, but it's also here. Hang on. I think I worked it out. I think it was open twice. And now we will do this. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, fine. We can carry on. Right, so clean-shaven Niels Brugger, Now, without any technical hitches. So this idea that the way we understand the past is shaped about how we talk about the past today this is how I understand, for instance, Tom Streeter's argument about the metonymization of the word internet. It forecloses history. It renders invisible earlier internets. It essentializes and reifies the current state of affairs in which we have the internet. So the internet, therefore, according to people like Streeter, is a discursive achievement as much as it is a technological one. And this is where I'm going with my talk here today by proposing as a title, "The Internet has always been about sharing," or has it? That my thought there was those stories we used to write when we were children, when crazy things happened, and then at the end of the story we'd write, and he woke up and it had all been a dream, and then we write, or was it? When I was 9, that was the end to my. Anyway, so these are the kinds of statements about the internet that I'm thinking about. The first is from a blog posted by Facebook's manager for Share in 2006, which accompanied the launch of the Share on Facebook bookmarklet. And we read here that ever since this whole internet thing got started, people have been sharing stuff left and right. So that's one quote. The second comes from a man called Dmitry Kleiner. He describes himself as a venture communist. I'm not sure what that is. But in 2011, he wrote that the internet has always been about sharing between users. Now, clearly, the key words for our purposes here are ever since and has always been. These are temporal terms. They make a claim about the past, which is linked, unbroken, to the present. And in both of these sentences, what's implied, though without the need to be stated, is that they still are and it still is. Now, obviously, I'm not opposed to the use of temporal terms per se. My book, after all, is called The Age of Sharing. This implies that sharing has a temporal boundedness. There's a beginning to this age. There's an end to this age. When are they? But what I want to ask is what it means to say that the internet has always been about sharing. So to start, I think that such statements, intentionally or not, attribute to the internet a telos, an objective. If the internet has always been about sharing, and it still is, then I think we're meant to extrapolate that it always will be. Sharing is presented as inherent to the internet. If the internet stops being about sharing, then it will no longer be the internet. And here there's a normative bias too, a quick hop from is to ought, based on our understanding of sharing as a good thing. So we have this kind of progression, I think. But has the internet always been about sharing? And how can we know if it has or hasn't always been about sharing? But I'm going to ask you just to hold that thought for a moment while I say a couple of words about sharing in the context of computing, in the short history of computing. So in a sense, but it's a boring sense, the internet has always been about sharing if we restrict ourselves to a very neutral technical sense of the term. And this is the sense of sharing as reflected, as I say, throughout the history of computing. The first instance, to the best of my knowledge, of sharing in the context of computing is time sharing, where a mainframe's time was divided up between the various users, right? So it's like you have 100th of a second, and you have 100th of a second, and you have 100th of a second, and so on. This then went to a sense of sharing as having in common. I'm thinking here of early shared disk drives, which were accessible by more than one user. Sharing then became making files available to remote others before becoming the transfer of files from one machine to another, which is today what people usually mean when they talk about file sharing. So the concept of sharing is quite central to the field of computing, and especially networks computing. But when people say that the internet has always been about sharing, as in the quotes I gave you presented earlier on, this is not what they mean. They don't mean that the internet has always been about copying ones and zeros from computer to computer. What they mean is that the internet has always been about sharing, which is why I give you this picture. The the Care Bear on the left. The purple one he's actually Share Bear. And so what they, when we think of sharing, we're thinking of a set of pro-social values and not just a technical description of data transfer. But in this case, if the internet has always been about sharing, then surely we should see the word sharing all over the internet and in texts about the internet from the very beginning of the internet, right? Well, not exactly. In an article of mine from 2013, I'm not going to go into it now, but I show how a rhetoric of sharing was adopted by social media sites only from the mid-aughts, from around halfway through the previous decade. So the way that social network sites framed themselves was not in terms of sharing until around 2006. Tip of the hat here to the Internet Archive, without which I wouldn't have been able to do this research. But to this, I'd like to add that commentators and scholars of the internet have also not been talking about the internet in terms of sharing for as long as we might think, if indeed the internet has always been about sharing. So let's have a look, for instance, at just a couple of quick examples. In his famous 1993 paean to cyberspace, Howard Rheingold extols the role of the internet in creating community, equality, self-expression, and so on. For him, computer networks offered the ability to rediscover the power of cooperation and to recapture the sense of cooperative spirit that so many people seem to lose when we gained all this technology, he writes. Now, so clearly we can see the concept of community is a central one for Rheingold, and yet, despite describing values that resonate powerfully with how we understand sharing today, this is simply not a concept that Rheingold uses to talk about the very early internet. It doesn't appear in his writings. Nor does it appear in Fred Turner's account of the ties between the cyberculture and the American counterculture. This was a book published in 2006, even when he's describing practices, again, that today we would call sharing. In the conclusion of his book, Turner describes the whole Earth electronic link, or the WELL, as having an emphasis on sharing intimacy and leveled social hierarchies. But again, this isn't terminology that he's taking from Rheingold. This is terminology that he's putting on an earlier writing. But despite this example, overall, Turner also hardly talks about sharing whatsoever, despite describing, the counterculture. So that's one example. I mean, 2 books, one example. If we turn to scholarship on the internet, we can see, for instance, in Boyden Ellison's very famous article about social network sites, that here too the concept of sharing is simply not one that they draw on. They mention file sharing. That doesn't really count for reasons that I can explain, but I don't have time to now. But if we jump forward to their 2013 reboot in their definition 2.0 of social network sites, sharing now takes center stage. So, for instance, they write, the desire to communicate and share content is a primary driver of SNS use. Or even more tellingly, I think for our purposes, they write, social network sites have evolved, but their foundational activities, what they've always been about, if you want, so their foundational activities, sharing content with a bounded group of users, are fundamentally the same. So my point here is that if sharing content is a foundational activity of social network sites, why don't they talk about that in their 2007 paper at all? And my answer is that sharing was not as culturally available as part of the discourse of the internet as it is now. And my research points to a period of around 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, that as the time that the internet became about sharing. Now, this obviously begs the question, what was the internet about before it was about sharing? What was the dominant metaphor for capturing the pro-sociality that was being associated with the internet? And the best answer I have is that it was about gifting. before it was about sharing. And Rheingold, for instance, conceptualized the well as a kind of gift economy. But perhaps the standout piece in this context is Richard Barbrook's 1998 piece on the high-tech gift economy. Another notable text is Marcus Giesler's 2006 analysis of Napster, which he calls a consumer gift system. And what's remarkable about Giesler's piece is that the idea of sharing actually appears throughout the article, but it doesn't strike Giesler as a notion around which to construct his theory of Napster. Again, my explanation would be that while Giesler was writing, the concept was not available to him as a heuristic in the way that it is to us today. Now, this then raises another question. How did sharing become such a dominant metaphor to the extent that people with such different outlooks as Facebook's manager for Share and a venture communist, that people with such different outlooks can claim that the internet has always been about sharing? Well, I think the answer lies in the rise of social media, and especially Facebook, which from 2006, as I mentioned earlier on, made sharing central to its activities. And Facebook itself has said that the power to share is the cornerstone of Facebook. There's plenty of talk in Facebook about sharing. So as social media have spread to become the internet in many ways, I think these are processes that people like Anne Helmond describe when talking about platformization. For instance, sharing has spread to become the internet's predominant metaphor. This is stuff that I'm fairly confident about. I've written about it in a number of places, but I want to now move on to say something about which I feel much less confident, and what I have to say is far more speculative in nature. So, one of the questions I'm often asked about my work on sharing, and especially by non-English speakers, is whether it applies elsewhere. Does it work in other contexts and in other languages? And people are polite when they ask me this, but what they mean is, your work is anglocentric. And it's kind of hard to argue with that. I mean, it is about a word in the English language. So what they mean to say politely is that English may be the first language of 25% of internet users worldwide, but Chinese speakers, for instance, constitute 20% of internet users worldwide. So much of what I have to say about sharing is to do with Western culture, maybe even more specifically North American culture, maybe even more specifically Californian culture, and maybe it's limited in scope. So I think this is a fair criticism, and in recent years I've been, unsuccessfully encouraging students to do the kind of work I've done on sharing in English, on the words for sharing in Hebrew. At some point, I think someone will pick up the gauntlet and do some work on that. In the meantime, I've started working with a talented PhD student from Peking University in China on the meanings of sharing in the context of the Chinese internet. And if we accept that there is more of the internet than comes out of North America and Europe, then can we say, for instance, that the Chinese internet has always been about sharing? What would it mean to make that kind of claim? Well, Luolin Zhao, the PhD student, and myself have just started collecting screenshots from the Wayback Machine, of course, for Chinese social network sites, in order to conduct a similar analysis to the one that I carried out for my 2013 article on English language social network sites. The early indications are that the Chinese internet has not always been about sharing either. Our working hypothesis is that we're going to find institutional isomorphism, the process whereby organizations come to have similar structures, and in this case, probably because of imitation. What we suspect is that the introduction of one of the Chinese translations for the word sharing to the sphere of social network sites is in response to Facebook's aggressive adoption of the term in 2006, but this is work at extremely early stages. But even if we do find that sharing in Chinese social media was directly imported from the US. The words for sharing in Mandarin have their own history and connotations, of course. Let me try and tell you something very, very briefly about these words. So what we know is that the main term for sharing in the context of social media is Feng Shang, and I apologize for my pronunciation. I apologize mostly to Luolin, and the rest of you have got no idea whether that was a good pronunciation or not. Now, prior to the appearance of the internet, this word meant dividing, very much like sharing in the 15th century. And in fact, the history of this character is of division. This used to be a knife dividing, which if you know anything about my work on sharing, this is fantastic, because that's what sharing used to mean in the 16th century, dividing, cutting, in English. During the 20th century, it took on new meanings of telling. Again, very much like sharing in English. And this telling included talk of a close, intimate, interpersonal nature. But this word is narrower in semantic scope than the English sharing. If sharing in English refers to interpersonal relations and also a just system of economic distribution, then the latter is referred to in the Chinese concept of gongshang, which is a word that is related to digital technologies, but mostly those that support the so-called sharing economy. Here we find extremely deep roots in Chinese culture, reaching back to Confucian texts about harmony and a peaceful world order. So these are the kind of things that are coming through when we talk about sharing in the context of the internet in China. So the first word I mentioned, Feng Shang, carries less cultural baggage. But this raises questions about how the use of these words in China may shape perceptions of and discourses around the internet in China. So this is, watch this space, I suppose. Let me try and offer a bottom line. The way we look at the internet of the past is always through a lens that has been shaped culturally, socially, by the past. And this is what I hope I have shown through the example of sharing and the question of whether that's what the internet has always been about. If we expand our scope to include other languages, I think we have the potential not only to remind us that there are multiple histories of multiple internets. This is a room where you don't need to explain that claim, but also that these histories are present in the variety of our present-day conceptualizations of the internet as well. And with that, I thank you very much.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you. Nick, great talk. This was very useful, provocative, and really interesting. I'm wondering how you've thought about maybe translation in a way that isn't just like sharing. Take this term and then move it into another language. Like, how do we conceptualize how parts of the idea of sharing from English might have made their way into the conception of the Chinese, but it got configured into a new thing of sharing that's not entirely separate. It partially grabbed onto this, but it also partially used, you know, the symbolic, what was available in Chinese at that time. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, and I mean, I think I don't really have an answer right now because this really is at very, very early stages. But I mean, I think, well, the idea of institutional isomorphism is that, you know, through imitation, ideas and practices and structures move from one place to another. We also know from the sociology of organizations literature that then there's local adaptation. So, I mean, I guess we'll be looking for that kind of stuff. I mean, I think that what you've done is just put the questions that we're asking in a cleverer way than I did, and I don't know yet what's going to come out at the other end. That's my best answer.
So I have a similar question, but I also can't phrase it as cleverly as you did. But so the internet is also always been about openness, I guess, in the beginning, at least. So how, and the internet in China has always not been about being open. So how the notions of openness and control relate to these translations of the concept of sharing in these different internets?
I think that what I would want to do with that question is sidestep it by saying that when I talk about whether the internet has or hasn't always, no, you know what, I can't really sidestep it, because maybe you're not saying that the internet really is, what I'm trying to avoid is any kind of statement about what the internet really is.
The early internet was also a rhetoric of openness. So
Yeah.
I guess the rhetoric of the early internet in China
Yeah.
is never about openness.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. But what the presence of
The internet in China were never the shaping forces
yeah, well,
of the internet elsewhere in the world.
yeah. So this is an empirical question. I mean, and hopefully we'll find out. But the word on the right, Gongshang, like I say, apparently this is, you know, what I've managed to learn in the last couple of weeks is that this is a word that also appears in a in a text that Chinese school children learn how to declaim by heart, which talks about harmony. So it would be interesting, obviously avoiding essentialist and orientalist notions of kind of Eastern spiritualism and stuff like that, which, you know, we will steer clear of. But that it will be interesting to see if these kinds of ideas are part of how the internet is discursively constructed elsewhere, outside of the US. I mean, I think that this kind of comparative, I mean, I think there's potential here to find out some interesting things about the internet in China and elsewhere. But again, I mean, I don't know yet what we're going to find. Is open as part of the discourse there? Don't know. But harmony would appear to be.
I'd like to follow up that question. And these words at the moment are decontextualized, isolated words. The real question, the way I see it, is what context do they appear in? Sharing, what words appear nearby the word sharing? What word appears nearby Feng Shang? And so on. And maybe, I don't know if you've done it or not, but perhaps then this idea of what is sharing could be given some kind of essence, or a certain essence or historical essence.
Mm-hmm. You're so right that's what I've done, but in English. I mean, a couple of things I've done with sharing in English are to look at the kinds of things that we were encouraged to share on social network sites during the first decade of this century, from sharing photographs to sharing your life to just sharing without any object at all, just share, you know, without being told what to share. In my book, there's a corpus analysis of the word sharing in English. Mostly it focuses on the 19th century, but one of the things also there I show is the words that co-locate with sharing, which words appear after sharing. And then you can see, I'm not going to go into this now, but you can see a very nice shift in the kinds of things that people are sharing. I was particularly interested in the idea of sharing emotions and sharing as a kind of talk. So yeah, that's spot on.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Any questions can be asked later. The next speaker will be Helmond from the University of Amsterdam, talking about using web archives and software repositories to examine the evolution of apps.
I'm so glad I remembered my Windows skills. Must have been Windows 1995. How do I go back? Gosh. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. It's really great to be here. So today I'll kind of contextualize my new project, which examines how we can use web archives and software repositories to examine the evolution of apps. So I'll situate my project by considering how newer forms of digital-born objects like apps pose new challenges to archiving as well as history writing. So my main aim is to contribute to periodizations of how web archiving challenges relate to new digital-born objects and those particular modes of historical inquiry. So at the core of my talk will be 3 natively digital-born objects that have developed over time. So the website, platforms, and most recently apps, which are quickly becoming a new, very important internet-enabled cultural medium. So yesterday, Niels Brugger addressed how we can study the web historically using web archives. In doing so, he also focused on the specific nature of the archived web and showed that there's a very strong relation also between the mode of archiving and the kind of modes of study that this enables. So my question is then, what kind of histories can be produced using the available web archives about websites, platforms, and apps? So initially the web consisted mainly of websites. And consequently, the website became, as Brugger has also argued, the main unit of archiving as well as the main unit of analysis. So over time, different institutions and different strategies for web archiving have emerged, and with them, they've also produced different kind of historical analysis. So building on earlier periodizations, for example, by Niels Brugger and Richard Rogers, of web archives and their preferred modes of history writing, I contribute to those by contextualizing 5 different moments in web historiography. So the first period could then be described as focusing on individual websites, which as you could mainly access these websites via a single URL, for example, in the Wayback Machine, which has now fortunately changed. But as a consequence, these archives produced single-site histories or maybe website biographies. For example, 10 years ago, we examined how Google has changed over time. So a second period focuses on the creation and analysis of so-called web spheres, as well as special collections, thereby producing event-based histories. And a third period is often described as the national turn in web archiving, with national libraries and national institutions getting into web archiving. And as these national archives very often crawl national domains, they're said to produce national web histories. And recently, we can see the rise of very interesting non-institutional ad hoc collections, or the so-called rogue archivists as from the archive team that were also introduced yesterday. And these are institutions that are archiving very popular web services and early web communities that are on the verge of being terminated, such as GeoCities. And as a Dutch person, I'm very happy that Hives, our pre-Facebook social network, was conserved. So these archives could set to produce early web culture or web community histories. And finally, there have been developments to go beyond the single website as the main unit of analysis, using these same web archives to reconstruct their lost context of the web. So an established approach is the reconstruction of historical hyperlink networks. For example, my colleague Esther Weltevrede and I used the hyperlinks of archived Dutch blogs between 2009 and 1999 and 2009 to reconstruct the evolution but also the decline of the Dutch blogosphere using Internet Archive data. And a more recent approach is where I aim to reconceptualize the website itself as an ecosystem that's inhabited by multiple actors. For example, content delivery networks, other third parties such as embedded content from social media platforms, trackers from advertising companies, and these all give signals about the larger context that these websites were embedded in. So what I did is I looked up the New York Times website in the Internet Archive and actually conducted what I called a historical source code analysis. So what I did, I looked in the source code of these archived snapshots to look for references to third parties. And here I kind of aim to reconstruct the tracking ecosystem of the website so we can get a sense of the techno-commercial environment that this website was embedded in over time. However, since the introduction of web archives, which we also heard yesterday, the web has changed significantly. And we have seen the rise of multiple new types of media and also arguably a new type of website, the platform. And platforms, I consider a specific type of website because they open themselves up to third-party developers who can then build on top of or build with these platforms. And as a consequence, a platform and its contributions are often distributed across multiple sites. And social media platforms in particular pose a very big challenge to traditional web archiving practices. So as we've heard, they are often very resistant maybe to archiving, to being archived, and therefore also by being studied, because they often put up exclusion protocols for the web archive crawlers. They're behind logins, they have dynamic feeds, they have personalized streams. Their current data is only available via so-called APIs. But despite these difficulties, there have been a number of very interesting attempts to actually archive and write histories of social media platforms. So here you see actually one of these challenges at work. So this is the login that's required, of course, to enter a social media site like Facebook. So if you look up Facebook, if you used to look up Facebook in the Internet Archive, this is what you would see. So yeah, can we tell a history about Facebook based on this empty login structure? However, if we look into the archive now, so this was my surprise in February, we can observe what seems to be a very creative solution by the Internet Archive, which was confirmed to me yesterday. So meet Charlie Archivist. That's the profile that we're seeing here. Charlie Archivist, born in January 2017. Charlie is a very empty profile. Charlie has no friends, no posts, no likes, no videos. Charlie is merely an empty feed. So such an ad hoc solution or such solution from the Internet Archive Wayback Machine at least attempts to document the empty structure of Facebook's architecture. So what follows next are some approaches that have been developed to archive social media and the kind of histories these enable. So first, the Library of Congress received the entire Twitter archive since 2006 as a donation. And in their press release, they stated that this information provides detailed evidence about how technology-based social networks form and evolve over time, and that this collection also documents a remarkable range of social trends. So what they're claiming here is that we can use the data as researchers to both write histories of the medium itself as well as about particular social events. So second, platforms like Twitter, for example, also create their own archives, if you will, as a mean of monetization. So archived social media data is then sold as a commodity via APIs, via data resellers, or via the platforms themselves. So whilst they provide paid access to historical platform data, they're not necessarily concerned at all with archiving these platforms for digital preservation. Data access to these archives is very expensive, and full historical archives are only accessible at a premium. So consequently, we could say that these archives cater to marketeers instead of researchers or historians. And finally, because it's purely the data of the platform, it's dislodged from its original context or production setting. And third, there have been attempts to live record personalized online experiences. For example, Rhizome's web recorder. So it can actually capture like a movie your experience on a social network site. But I would argue that these recordings are highly selective and highly personalized and therefore not very scalable. So if we then return to the Library of Congress, they actually changed their policy because it was facing very infrastructural challenges in storing and making the data accessible. So now they're closing it also down and focusing more on thematic or event-based collections. So how else to approach this? What other kinds of materials do we have at our disposal to reconstruct the history of platforms and their larger ecosystems? So here I also want to move towards more medium history. So how can we study the evolution of the platforms instead of their content or their users? So there have been a number of previous studies into the transformation of a single media platform as well as their larger ecosystems. But most of these studies, due to all these limitations, were based on secondary materials like blog posts and screenshots collected from the web. So whilst most major social media platforms are not systematically archived, their primary materials, such as developer documentation and product documentation, are in fact archived. And with my colleagues Fernando van der Vlist and David Nieborg, I've used this kind of materials to think about platform evolution. So here's an example of the kind of material from the Internet Archive that we have available in the Wayback Machine. So these are the technical documentation pages for Facebook that explain developers what kind of data they can use or retrieve from the platform or how they can build their applications on top of Facebook. So we then looked up all these developer pages for specific elements over time to document the kind of technical evolution of this platform, to gain a sense of the rise and transformation of Facebook as a development platform and also a data platform for third parties. So mapping these changes then can offer important insights into the technical and economic evolution of a platform. So for example, we mapped all the data points that you can collect from their API over time. And we can also, for example, see the introduction and removal of particular targeting fields for advertising, where most recently the field for targeting on ethnic affinity was removed due to recent controversies. So here we're examining how the platforming is opening itself up and also closing itself down, which is particularly relevant with the recent discussions around Cambridge Analytica. So I actually went way back in the Wayback Machine to look up actually into these first apps that were built on top of Facebook. So this has been happening since 2006. So if we want to understand the whole Cambridge Analytica data retrieval thing, we need to go way back, 2006. So this is actually one of the first apps I found that was collecting political data on users and their friends. And here it's also introduced as, yeah, this is my app for collecting pointless and useless info about all your friends, but it also includes political status. So here you can see that since 2006-07, it was already available, that kind of data, and has been collected by these app developers since. So the Cambridge Analytica scandal, if we look at it in a longer period of time, it's absolutely not a bug, it's a feature of the platform. So we were also interested in examining the larger ecosystem that Facebook is embedded in. So what we did is Facebook has a lot of partners that it works with to help implement their products, and they also gain exclusive access to platform data and functionality. And these so-called official Facebook partners help also with various advertising needs and also get exclusive access to the advertising side of Facebook. So if we go into the archive, we can find lists of all these partners over time. So what we did is we collected all these lists and then kind of visualized their partnerships. So here you can see all the partners that have been added and removed over time. And here you can actually see a kind of stabilization in partnerships over time, which is kind of indicative of a consolidation in the social media marketing ecosystem. So what we did is we then also mapped these kind of partner networks over time. I'm going a bit quickly due to time, but we actually mapped all these partnerships, which is a very common practice in social media, for the top 20 social media platforms. And for us, this is a way to understand the kind of infrastructure that these platforms are creating for the also kind of circulation of user data for advertising. So it's both a social network of organizations working together, as well as technical integrations between their products where they can access each other's data. So we're also mapping this over time using Internet Archive data to get a sense of how this network has evolved and shaped over time, to get a sense of how these social media players are emerging within this larger digital marketing ecosystem. So the final object that's very new, which is also not a web object on sich, but is very often connected to web platforms, are apps. And apps are very, very ephemeral media objects that are not inherently archived. So the main access point to apps is via their native distribution environment, the app stores. And I'm already saying, just like Nicholas, that there are app stores, because we know the Google Store, we know the Google Store, and we know the Apple App Store. But as you can see from this timeline that we've created of the introduction of app stores over time, there are over 100 app stores available, because Android is open source, so anyone can build their own version of an Android store. So you have Android stores for maybe porn apps, you have Android stores tied into a particular phone or a particular provider. So you have a very large proliferation of app stores. So while Google and Apple have become dominant in this story about mobile apps, here I also want to go back and emphasize how app stores like Symbian from Nokia and Palm OS were actually, really early app stores that carried apps. So the question then is how and to what extent we can these app stores and their apps have been archived for future research. So fortunately, many app stores do not merely exist on our mobile phone, but they also have a web interface. And luckily, the web interfaces of the main two app stores have been archived in the Wayback Machine. And for me as a researcher, this opens up new and unique opportunities for app historical research. Because we can see in the archive not only what was popular at the time, but we can find individual apps which contain all their details and metadata, descriptions, screenshot, ratings, similar apps, the permissions that these apps ask. So in my new research project, my aim is to develop methods to use these kind of materials to understand how these apps have evolved over time. And to complement my source set, I'm also using so-called software repositories, and in particular APK repositories. And APK is the Android file for apps. So repositories are locations for storage, so they're different than archives. But some of them contain older versions of apps that I can download. And here I also want to emphasize that while we could, try to emulate these apps, which is going to be a very tedious and hard job, as Michael has also shown, I want to go beyond emulation and investigate their source code, because when you look into the source code of these mobile apps, you can also find details about the larger production and commercial context that they're embedded in. So to go towards my conclusion, I'm also venturing for myself into new areas where, for example, I found a lot of commonalities also with colleagues who are working in archival studies, but also in media art institutions, where they've been dealing with conserving media art for over a decade. And we've seen a lot of similarities between trying to think about the history of apps and media art objects. So to conclude, I addressed how newborn digital objects pose new challenges for archiving and for writing their histories. But I want to end on a bright side. I've also demonstrated the multivalency of web archives to write histories of such digital-born objects. Because as I've demonstrated, even though we can think about the limits of these web archives, I, as a researcher, have found great value and treasure troves in these archives. So we can use web archives to study single websites, single platforms, and single apps, but also their larger ecosystems that they're embedded in by considering the materials that are available to us on various scales, from the source code of archived digital objects to the core documentation of these objects. Thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you are looking at how these sort of partnerships have evolved over time and getting a sense of that, but could you give us a glimpse of what that involves? I'd be really interested to hear how they have evolved.
Yeah, so in that particular project, we're also complementing this data about which partners have been added and deleted with historical interview data. So we're working with a colleague in Canada, David Nieborg, who has conducted interviews with these industry actors over the past 7-8 years. And so he's also asked them about their relationship with Facebook. So for example, how do they indeed, as a partner, work with Facebook? And he has a couple very interesting stories about how these partnerships were terminated on Facebook ends, because they were, for example, not adhering to their privacy policy or their data policy. But what's a running thread in these in this interview data is the central importance. It's a kind of like mutual dependency of the partners and Facebook with each other, where we're trying to also tease out the drama of these relationships when they become forged and terminated.
Can you see that in the data?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, so these are the officially declared partnerships, but then there are also unofficially that are not listed on the website, where people get special access to special access points, for example. We can definitely see in the data also when, for example, something in their technical infrastructure changes, that there's a new list of partners, or that there's a removal of a whole category. So that's kind of impactful of also how that industry around the social media platforms evolve, because they basically, if Facebook removes one technical aspect, one part of this industry might collapse. So what we've really strongly seen in the data is the rise of partnerships around mobile data. So you can really see once Facebook technically opens up for mobile development, there's an influx of people like specializing in mobile advertising, mobile targeting, and all these other things. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. I'm curious about that Facebook example that you showed on the Wayback Machine, in which the page said, basically the page status that they have access to all this information. But do you have any web archived page that actually shows some of this private information that should not be gathered from Facebook?
So what we do have is what Facebook made available. So we can try to match indeed what people are saying they are gathering towards what Facebook is actually offering. But we can't see from the side of this developer what he actually collected in his database, for example. There's no way of doing it. And also in this case, what's interesting is that, as you can see from the URL, this app, the early Facebook apps were hosted on external, basically on the host of the developer, and then calling on Facebook. So they were all outside of Facebook. Now all these apps, most of them reside inside Facebook. But it's the same with web server logs. We don't have access to the actual, data that they're collecting or when it was collected, unfortunately.
Sorry, only if you try to see for yourself, if you are on Facebook, you see what I mean? If you have access to a photo, so you can only go back by asking the archive for one person. You can ask to Facebook and you go way back.
Yeah. But that's very incomplete.
And I think you can see a lot of points what you already pointed here.
Yeah, but it's a very incomplete archive that Facebook is giving us. There's lots missing there.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating. And so Charlie may or may not be a cat, actually. Just to be clear, Charlie Archivist. So our apps, this word apps, we use a lot as if it's meaning one thing. Obviously, it means lots of different kinds of things. And I'll also just note as a preamble, we also did a recent exercise of looking back at the evolution of the Facebook's privacy policy. And, that was useful. But so just like at least 3 different kind of apps and what to do about them. Obviously, we call Facebook apps, Android, iOS, Web OS, those kind of apps. Oftentimes when people talk about these kind of apps, that's what I think they're talking about. And so, I think it's important that we archive, encapsulate, and then provide a way to do long-term, reliable replay of all these environments. So we need all of the environment there to do that. But oftentimes when people use the word apps in the context that I hear about at these conferences, they're talking about like quote-unquote news apps. They're really talking about web-based apps. I reference Meredith Bouchard at NYU, who does a lot of work in this space. And I encourage you to look into her work and see how we could all help in this effort. So an example of that would be where a media organization, maybe the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, has an interactive web-based application, which is often some sort of an infographic or something like that. There was one recently on the front page of Huffington Post, which was called Perspectives, and it was all about promoting an HBO series about 9/11. You can't get it now, and so the only way you can get it is if you had encapsulated all of the back-end material and be able to run it. And so I think Docker containers can be our friend here for these kind of things. But anyway, your talk definitely inspired me to go back and work harder.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And now for the final speaker of the session, Marta Severo from the University Paris Nanterre, using web archives for studying online participation, the case of cultural heritage, collaborative platforms. Thank you.
No, I hope not. So everyone has done, but I want to do again. Thank you, Arnaud, for this invitation. For this is really amazing. You will see my presentation is really related to the previous presentation. It's a kind of a confirming sensation. It's very important. Anyway, web archives is not my object of research. It's more a tool I use in my research. I'm not an historian, I'm more a social scientist, if we have to choose a label. Anyway, I work on online participation, and more specifically now I work on citizen science platform. What does it mean? Citizen science platform are websites that are built by institutions for engaging citizens, volunteers in building a common knowledge. We have several examples yesterday, no? The Portuguese portal that asks for links and so on. So it's a very growing phenomenon. And so my problem is, usually what happens that I discover that there is a very interesting platform when the project is big. We have a lot of volunteers that accept the challenge and they work together. Everything, the knowledge that they have to build, I don't know, the database, the annotation, what is it, everything is done. So how I can discover what happens, why volunteers were motivated to participate on it. So our web archives, which web archives can help me. It's kind of strange that is like beeping like this. Anyway, so I presented already a first presentation in London last year about this. My question is, how web archives should manage online participation? Which is the information should be kept? It's like, no, your question, and finally, what we have to find in web archives. And my problem, last year I presented a state of art of what we found in web archives, considering I studied some platform. This is the most, one of the most famous, Galaxy Zoo. What is this platform? You can go there and then you have photos of galaxy, and then you have kind of checkbox. You can choose which is the form of the galaxy you see. Really, it's like a game. People go there, they have points if they feel a lot of galaxy and so on. There is a community around this. And you have a lot of information in web archives. In Internet Web Archives, you have more than 1,000 screen catcher, and then you have all these platforms are related with open data projects. So everything is available for download, usually. Also, for example, here in Wikipedia, you have a very documented page. So Anat asked me last year, but why you don't, it's not enough ask to the institution to provide the information. Why do you need web archives? So I thought 1 year on this, because I was convinced it was not enough. Today I have the question 1 year later. So, let's take another example. This is the platform of British Library. There are several projects also here. You can annotate some document. So what you have also a platform where you can download all data related to contribution, all data related to annotation, everything. So I don't need even web archives. Everything is there. What is not there? Is not there the fact that there is a community website where there is a forum where people are chatting. What is not there? There is the fact that there is volunteers, that there is a classification every day, so they evaluate themselves compared to the others. Then there is a change on Twitter, some official one, other more difficult to find because there is no clear hashtag, for example. So do I need all this for studying this phenomenon? So yes, this is why it's not enough web archives or national web archives institution information. What the main point as a social scientist for me is the relationship that is built between the cultural institution that open the platform and the volunteers that contribute. Especially if we consider today with social media we have a new form of contribution of what is called pro-amateur, people that do with passion, they do like professional this kind of job. So how can I study the role of the platforms, the editorial choice, how volunteers contribute, change the platform with the use and so on. Okay, So just to provide you a big picture, we have different kind of projects in the specific case of cultural heritage. We have the most known, there are crowdsourcing platforms where you have very simple tasks. You can copy, choose image, everything is blocked. You have a very simple action to do. The second type of project, there was a fashionable a few years ago, now is less popular. Like in museum, you have folksonomies. It means that you have like image, you can suggest tag and categories. So it is a little more open, even if there is a validation process differently managed by institution. And then there are the co-creative project, very open, where you have a sort of wiki and Wikipedia, or directly Wikipedia or blocking structure. Edition is more open. So what I need to keep for this kind of project, this is my answer finally, why I need web archives, because I need a multi-actor approach. The main point is don't have the point of view of institution, but try to see how all the actors are involved. So does it mean that I need to know how blogs are evolving at the same time of volunteers? I need to know how the technical platform change according to critics of volunteers. I need to know how people move from a platform to the other, how they communicate on Facebook, on Twitter, and then they come back on the platform. And then there is a final point, I didn't know how to call it, but the problem is that generally, today institution, all this phenomena at the base is the problem of lack of funds, so there is no money. So we ask for the aid of people, and also we have no money to maintain platforms. So often platforms change, they don't have backup. So there is really a problem to see the continuity in this kind of phenomenon from the technical point of view. So my answer is that we need to build like an STS, a social science technology point of view, looking at this aspect. And to do this, we need to rediscover, I will go there, rediscover our role. I mean, sometimes we ask too much from web archives. We think that in an archive we find everything. Our archives finally are just the data part. And then we need our methods, and we don't have to forget traditional methods. I mean, it's based on my experience. I do this all the time. I go on a web archive, and then I say, it's not enough for my object of study. I forget my origin, my traditional method of ethnographer that are necessary for building the ecosystem, not just the technological ecosystem, but the ecosystem of people. So I will provide an example, I hope, a kind of best practice. It's a French case, so I'm sorry if some slides are in French. It's a project called Un jour un poilu. It means one day, one soldier of the First World War. What is the project? Okay, the story is this. In 2003, the Ministry of Defense in France built this website, Memories of Men, for providing all the database related to the world war and especially to soldiers. So you have a lot of databases, are digitalized files, almost are incomplete. So few years later, in 2011, they have the idea to provide a collaborative platform inside this to ask the help of citizens to fill some files. This is the structure of the file, no, the paper one. There are 1,400,000 of paper like this corresponding to soldiers dead for the France. And then you have an interface to annotate almost pre-filled form. Anyway, you have to just copy this information. what happens after 2 years of the project? You have a news on the website that say there was a big success because 6,000 files was filled. It means that in 25 years the database will be finished. But one guy, Jean-Luc Gillot, decide to launch a challenge on Twitter. So it's just an hashtag, it's nothing more. And this hashtag is, I show you, this is the first tweets. So you understand, the first tweet is in 17 November 2013. And says just project one day, one soldier, it start to index one file each day. With his friends, they just post on Twitter every day one file. They start like this, very quietly. And then, so this is a little more organized 1 year later. And usually this is the structure of the Twitter. You have the photo, you have the paper file, so on. Today is the hazard, but normally today the database will be completed. So in 2 years they completed 1,400,000 files, thanks to this Twitter challenge. So the problem is, okay, I was interested. The media started to cover this in 2000, 2 years later, but the big news went out in January this year. So in January this year, I decided to work on this. So how we can do, you know, I have poor research, so I cannot buy premium database and data. What I can do? So I use, okay. What was available to me. I mean, I tried everything. So the first strategy was a Wayback Machine. So I discovered that the website of the project was built 2 years later, the beginning. It's very empty, so it's completely unuseful. And then I tried to find Twitter data. It was not so easy, but I had the idea to try the Inatech, the database that was presented yesterday by Claude Moussou. I asked, the hashtag was not collected, but I have a surprise because not everything, but I had a good sample available inside this database. I have the first one. Now the capture you have seen the capture is the interface provided by the Inatect. So a very nice capture where you have data, you have all the information you need. Why I had this information inside this database, this was the problem. Because there was a journalist of France 24 that was really engaged in this challenge. She was really, she tweeted a lot. Actually, she is the reason why there was a mediatization of the project. In my view, is the reason of the success of this project. So the curation of the web archive, of this web archives, allow me to identify the main points, allow me to identify what happens. Today, I will not present today, but I have all the corpus, I mean, that correspond 100,000 tweets. It's more difficult to analyze it. I mean, I have not so much more than what I found with this. So I found some interesting things. For example, the yellow one is the hashtag, the first hashtag used for the challenge. The green line is the tweet of the institution. I mean, the institution start to tweet related to the project just 2 years later, the beginning of the project. As you can see, they don't use the hashtag. They communicate about the project, but they don't recognize the role of volunteer. They really, just at the end, they have a very, I don't put screen capture. You have a kind of tweet, they say bravo to all contributors, but without the hashtag. So I have a very important information about my social question there. And then using Inatech, the other archive for OINA about audiovisual, I could find the first mediatization of the project. It corresponds exactly where in the peak we have in the Twitter activity. And then there is our friend Facebook again. What we can do with Facebook, because after 2 years, also a Facebook page was open. Sadly, it's not so interesting because the Facebook page is just a republication of tweet. And there is a Facebook private group that is amazing because you have the more active contributors that discuss on it. They discuss about technical problem. So what we do with the public page, we have NetWiz for a few days maybe, but we have still, the project is almost closed. I'm the limit, the post is inside the limit of 1,000, so everything is okay. What I can do for the group, and finally it was quite easy because the person was interested in research, so I can have a backup provided by the person that managed, the administrator of the group. It's just to say that this is the end of a process. At the beginning was, I'm the web internet archive, there is nothing about my project, what I can do, I have no information. Actually, today I have a big picture, I see all the actors I have to study, I can make interviews, I can make everything that I need, I can use different web archives, I can ask web archives also institution. But what is important, my point to conclude, is that we really, when we want to do research about a social phenomenon on internet, we have to have a large spectrum. We have to consider web archives in a very general way, not just national archive. Maybe it's kind of obvious, but sometimes I think we are on an area we forget. We can also consider the use of Wikipedia as a web archive, for example. We consider that a lot of people make personal archives. Like for example, Twitter, I found Twitter by a friend that collect this tweet. And then we have traditional methods, so we can make interviews, public observation, participant observation, kind of traditional, that can be very useful for study online participation. But the final question, this is the same question, almost the same of Michael yesterday, is with all this, are we really able to study the spirit and the enthusiasm of online participation? Which is the information I really need? I mean, I really need all this. I have no answer. I can just provide you the emoticons related to this corpus. That's it.
So let's collect some questions. Yeah.
So I really like your approach of, okay, it's not in the Internet Archive, where else do I go? And then you showed this nice list of different kind of source materials. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on how do you align the different types of source materials? How do you connect them? Do you find like it's sometimes difficult, there's a discrepancy between them, or how do you deal with these different types of source materials?
Yeah, actually, I'm facing this problem because I'm writing a book on this, so it's a problem. From the practical viewpoint, I mentioned this telling a story with some separate space for a more technical aspect. So it's like it's really an ethnographical approach. I mean, I have all my material, and finally I just generate a story about what happened. But yes, it's a real problem of representativeness, especially.
Hi. You said you used different sources. I was wondering if, for the study related to the World War I, did you use the IAPC collection on the celebration of the World War One war? Because do you know? Are you aware of this collection?
No, I didn't try it, but I think that I have to try, but I don't think I will find a lot more than this. I mean, all this information that I have this was not that I collected the object I studied, but was the hashtag 1WM. So I think they have the same information, I think. But yeah, I have to check.
Thanks again. So one thing about your method is that it showed these two parallel worlds of activity that seem to not connect, that the Twitter users were over here and then the institution was over here. Do you have a sense of what you might do to investigate the gap between these two? Because it was so interesting to see how you integrated the different sources that produced this apparent disconnection. Do you have a sense of how you might resolve that or investigate that further?
Yeah, I have already. Actually, I didn't mention the last phase of the project that is kind of amazing when you see it. Today, the National Archive have built a new platform. It's called Testament de Poilou. It's a platform built to gather all the energy of contributors for a new annotation project. So there was an institution, there were contributors, and then a new institution go inside the game and try to. In this case, we will see what happens. It's new, but they have a person that manages the relationship with contributors. So the institution, I met her, so they have like an intermediary person that I don't think it will work. This is my my view, because what they have done here is that they have provided some comment chat space inside the platform. I mean, they don't accept to use an hashtag. They don't suggest an hashtag, but they provide some space for discussion inside the platform. So I don't think it will working, but they have this idea to have a person that is trusted by the community. We will see. So.
Any final questions? Okay, so thanks a lot.